Hello, everybody, and welcome to what is part two of a little investigation into the effects of stress. And if you haven't watched part one, I'll leave a link in the description below because it's important to look at that first before looking at this episode, part two. And the reason why it's important to look at part one first, I think, is not just because it's part one, but because it's actually looking at what stress is or what the stress response is inside of us. What that means, both biologically and physiologically. And we need to understand that before we can move on to part two, which is the implications of that in our modern world. So we saw in part one that the stress response, the fight or flight response, is ancient. It goes back hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, and was designed, evolved is probably the right word, to get us out of trouble when we were hunting, when we were foraging in the forests around the world, in the undergrowth around the world. And now, having watched part one, we understand how that works and what that means. We need to think about, well, what does that actually mean for us now in the modern world? And having said that it's something that has evolved over the aeons, over millions of years, my question would be, have we evolved sufficiently to cope with the modern world that we find ourselves in? And my short answer is no, we haven't, and let's look at why that is the case. If we look at the history of us, Homo sapiens, we have been around roughly 250,000 years. Our ancestors have obviously been around for a lot longer than that. We're just talking about modern man. When I say modern man, Homo sapiens, if we went back in time 250,000 years ago and met some of our ancestors, they would look just like us. Yeah, okay, they're going to be a bit smellier and a bit hairier, but if we clean them up, put them in modern clothing, and they were walking down our local high street, we wouldn't know the difference. They would look just like us. So we know from the fossil records that anatomically, a human being from 250,000 years ago is not really any different to a human being now. And we have to make the assumption that physiologically it's probably no different. We're no different to our ancestors physiologically. However, what is fundamentally different now compared to 250,000 years ago is the environment that we live in and our lifestyle that we have. And it's not just different now to that it was 250,000 years ago. It's different to how it was 249,000 years ago. It's different to how it was 248,000 years ago. Know where I'm going, don't you? It's also different to how it was 100,000 years ago, different to how it was 50,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, broadly, is the start of civilization. The Mesopotamian, Sumerian culture in the bit between the river Tigris and the river Euphrates. That's kind of where we think civilization, as in domesticating cattle, agriculture, towns, as opposed to living a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. That's roughly when it started, 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. So we have from 250,000 years ago, not a lot happening in terms of the population of the planet and the lifestyle of the inhabitants of the planet. And then maybe 7,000, 5,000 years ago, things start to change a wee bit, but very gently. And it's only really post-industrial revolution, so we're talking about 1850, that things started changing and we started building big things, bridges, roads, all of that, trains, railways. and things started changing quite a bit. 1902, that was the first powered flight. That was the Wright brothers. 1952, that was the first commercial jet airliner, something, well, before the pandemic we took for granted, hopping on a plane and flying somewhere. But 1952, that's 6 years before I was born. That's the first commercial jet airliner going into service. If we go back a couple of generations, my grandparents were around in the early 1900s working. And we think back to what that was like in the early 1900s. Cars had just arrived on the scene. No real telecommunications network, no processed foods, no supermarkets. Nobody really had electricity, refrigerators, central heating, all of that kind of stuff. My grandparents. So really in the last 100 years, we've had an acceleration of our environment that we've lived in. So we've lived in, for 250,000 years, a fairly stable hunter-gatherer type environment. And then we've had a bit of a kick, sort of 5,000 years ago, very gentle, a little bit more of a kick post-industrial revolution. But the last 100 years, particularly the last 50, the last 30, have, really taken off. Now, when we consider the sorts of things that caused anxiety in my grandparents, forget about going back 250,000 years ago. Let's just go back to, say, 100 years ago, the 1920, 1921. The sorts of things that were in the environment there for people that were causing stress were just very, very minimal compared to that they are now. And if you look at your life, your day-to-day life, and the things that cause you stress and anxiety, they'll be fairly unique. Your parents won't have had many of these things. My parents didn't get concerned about the stuff that they saw on social media. They didn't get concerned about stuff they read on the internet. They didn't have to worry too much about credit card bills because they didn't have credit cards. There wasn't a huge pressure to own your own property and to have 2 or 3 holidays. The first holiday my parents had outside of the UK was probably the early 1970s. They weren't used to hopping on planes. It was a big thing when my mum got on a plane for the first time. That was this big thing in 1971, 1972, something like that. That was a big thing. Now, most of us these days have been on a plane at least once. So there's been this dramatic change over the last 50 years, definitely the last 30, drastic change of lifestyle. And if you sit down and think about that, a lot of those things that have changed are causing or contributing towards stress and anxiety. Sitting in traffic jams, being in the queue at the airport, wanting to get to the airport on time, having to respond to phone calls, the phone's ringing, or I'm in the middle of doing something, the phone's ringing, I'll answer the phone. Emails, text messages, tweets. It's stimulating. We go back to part 1, the video part 1, perceived threats. Now, I'm sure if you post something on social media and you see somebody's had a bit of a pop at you, or they've countered your thought or whatever, that stimulates a reaction within you, and it stimulates that stress response, that fight or flight response. And as we saw in part 1, that keeps being stimulated, that keeps releasing a lot of chemicals, mainly adrenaline, cortisol, in the body. And what that does is that increases our heart rate, increases our blood pressure, increases the strain on our cardiovascular system, and will make us more prone to, guess what, heart attacks and strokes. So that's some silly examples, but what I would suggest to you very much is anything that you can remove from your life that will reduce your anxiety and stress levels, do so, even if it's fairly drastic, like people that cause you stress and anxiety. Even if they're family members, you've got to put yourself first and think very carefully, do I want this person in my life? Is my life going to be better? Is my health going to be better by not having this person in my life? Not having this thing in my life, not having this thing to worry about, whatever that may be. Now, just as a silly example, when I had my stroke, we were living near Oxford, very expensive part of the country to live in. And it became apparent that I wasn't going to be able to go back to work, and we couldn't actually afford to live where we were living. So also all the noise and the hustle and the bustle, it just totally did not help me make improvements after my stroke and brain surgery. So we took the decision to move where it was quieter, where it was cheaper, where it was cooler, because I had a problem with the heat. So I think it was August 2013, a few months after my stroke, we had a heat wave down south, and this just wiped me out. I remember sitting in our lounge in t-shirt and shorts for days on end, just unable to move. So it was like, got to get away from heat. So anyway, to cut a long story short, Scotland. My mum was born in Scotland. I've got relatives up in Scotland. So we decided to make the big move, to move from Oxford to the south of Scotland. Best thing I've ever done for me and my health. My wife and I love it here. Absolutely love it. It's quiet. It's peaceful. The people are lovely. Your money goes much further. And a lot of the things that I was worried about, concerned about, stressed about, anxious about, were removed by moving up here. Once I got over the effort of packing everything up, the physical move and the anxiety that all that caused, once that settled down, best thing I've ever done. So that's a pretty extreme example, but I think what you've got to do is look at your circumstances and look at your lifestyle and say, what can I do to make my life less anxious, less stressful, to reduce this kind of constant drone of low-level chronic stress triggers that are coming in on a regular basis, whether they be financial, whether they be people that you deal with, friends, family, whatever they are, your neighbours, the environment that you live in, whatever it is, living near a main road and that is a very noisy, whatever it is, just look at how they can be reduced. Start with the quick wins, the easy things to resolve, deal with those first, and then have a long-term plan about actually, so this is a bit major, I need to physically move house, home, how can I do that, where am I going to move to, whatever, but just basically get the things that make you stressed or anxious down to the fewest, the lowest that you can, because your health depends on it. So that's the lecture over with. Sorry if it did come across a bit like a lecture, but it's something that I know for me has really had a big impact on me, and it would be great to think it could have a big impact on a few of you guys as well. So thank you very much for watching, and look after yourselves, take care, and see you soon. Bye bye now.